الرجيم. Hello and welcome, my dear students, in this lecture. I hope all of you okay, and we will continue in chapter number 3 today. And before we go to chapter number 3, as you see, Anglo-Norman period, let me remind you about the previous lecture, which called the Anglo-Saxon or Old English period. It was chapter number 2, and I discussed the historical background of Anglo-Saxons or Old English literatures. If you remember, also I gave you Piolf and the main characteristics of Piolf, the summary and the plot, and I talk about Beowulf as the first English epic. How is it important? Why we should read Beowulf in Old English literature. After that, we discuss also the Christian writers of the Anglo-Saxon period, like firstly Caedmon in 7th century and Sinolf in 8th century, and also finally Alfred. We talk about him. I gave you their masterpieces, what they introduced to all the English literature poems and their style, their structures, and all these things we discussed. So I hope that you understood. And today, let me start here. The first chapter number 3. The first contains here what you will find here, that historical introductions about Anglo-Norman period. I'll discuss also I'll discuss or explain the conquest here. Third, literary ideals of the Normans. Finally, literature of the Norman period. Now, let us open this slides and see the Normans. The name Norman, which is Southern form of Northman, tells its own story. I mean here that the term Anglo-Norman is generally used to describe the period of English history from the Norman conquest to the middle of the 14th century. Here it was called so because the non-Latin literatures of that time was written in Anglo-Norman. So the French here dialect spoken by the Norman invaders. So the Normans here were pagan, barbarian pirates from Denmark, Norway, and Ireland. So they began to make destructive plundering raids on European castles, especially settlements in the 8th century. So as you see, they were now known as Normans, men of Normandy, and their land became known as the land of the Normandy or Northmen. So the men who bore the name came originally from Scandinavia, Pans, and of big planned fearless men crossing after a plunder and adventures in their Viking ships, and brings terror whatever they appeared. It was these same children of Woden who, under the Danes' raven flag, had plotted out Northern civilizations in the 9th century exactly. Later, the same race of men came plundering along the French coast and conquered the whole northern country. But here, the results were altogether different. So, I can summarize all this background or historical here background, that the Norman introduced the feudal system into the country, which can be seen as a pyramid with the king at the top, and the serf or the servants of the Norman lords at the very bottom. In between, the society considers of the displaced Anglo-Saxons range according to the to rank and power. So the Norman rulers continue to use their own language. They did not adopt English, the language spoken here by the conquered people, nor did they impose French on the English. Thus, French became the language of the ruling race, English, that of the displaced nobility and the common people. So the clergy here, however, spoke and wrote Latin. So during the century after the Norman conquest, literature in English came to a standstill as it was displaced by French, which became the language of Pied letter. Uh, for 200 years, English literature was in French. So, in the 12th and 13th century, several forms of literatures appeared and were developed. Some of these, like let me say, like the lyric ballad, had continued in their oral form in the interior. But Anglo-French literatures, which means all writing in English written by French writers here, I mean, in French, was a powerful influence upon English literature throughout the Middle English period. So Norman writers were very much inspired by the stories of the legend Celtic King Arthur and his knights of the round table, which they told and retold, adding and changing details to suit their audience. So you have to understand all these as a background of the Normans and the origins of the Normans as introductions or historical introductions. Let us move now to the second slide and see the conquest. Here, as you see, we simply point out three great results of the conquest which have a direct bearing on our literature. As you see, the conquest here first, uh, notwithstanding Caesar's legends and Augustan monks. I mean here that the Normans were the first to bring the culture and the practical ideal of Roman civilizations home to the English people. And this a critical time when England had produced her best and her own literature and the civilizations had already begun to decay. Second, here the forced upon England to national idea. I mean here that is a strong centralized government to replace the loose authority of a Saxon's chief over his tribesmen, and the world's history shows that without a great nationality, a great literature is impossible. This is the second, as you see, force. The third now here, third, they brought to England the wealth of a new language and literatures, and our English gradually absorbed both. I mean here that for 3 centuries after Hastings, French was the language of upper classes, of courts and schools and literatures. Yet it was so hardly. Did the common people cling to their own strong speech that in the end English absorbed almost the whole body of French words and became the language of the land. So therefore, it was the weldings of Saxons and the French into one speech that produced the wealth of our modern English. Now, let us go to literary ideal of the Norman. The change in the life of the conquerors from Norman men to Normans, from Vikings to Frenchmen, is shown most clearly in the literatures which they brought with them to England. Here, from the 20th, 20th through the 14th century, Anglo-Norman was second only to Latin in its use as a literary language in England. Most types of literary works uh, were represented in Anglo-Norman as in French, with a slight differences of emphasis. So the chanson was an exception. This type of a French epic poem was not unknown in England, but there seem to have been no original work of this kind written here. So Anglo-Norman's works were known, copied, or imitated on the continent. Now, the Old Norse strength and grandeur, the magnificent sage telling of the tragic struggles of men and gods, which still stir us proudly, these have all disappeared. So here we can add it, and their place is a bright, very talkative literature, which runs to endless verses and which makes a wonderful romance out of every subject it touches. So the theme may be religion or love or history, the deeds of Alexander or the misdeeds of among, but the author's here purpose never varies. He must tell a romantic story and amuse his audience, and also the more wonders and impossibilities he relates, the more surely is he believed. So we are reminded here in reading of the native Gauls who would stop every traveler and compel him to tell a story before he passed on. So there was more of the Gaul than of the Norseman in the conquered, and far more and fancy than of thought or feelings in their literature. So it is necessary only to remember the relative condition of the two races who lived side by side in England. Uh, on, uh, on the one hand, the Anglo-Saxons were a conquered people, and without liberty, a great literature is impossible. So the inroad of the Danes and their own tribal wars had already destroyed much of their writings, and in their new conditions of servitude, they could hardly preserve what remained. This is the second. On the other hand, represented the civilization of France, which country during the early Middle Age was the literary and educational center of all Europe. They came to England at the time when the idea of nationality was dead, when cultural had almost vanished, when Englishmen, let me say, lived apart in narrow isolation, and they brought with them low cultural, the prestige of success, and above all, the strong uh, impulse to share in the great world's work and to join in the moving current of the world's history. So this is some introductions or some, let me say, important introductions about the ideal of the Normans here. You have to understand. Let us go now to literature of the Norman period and see here. Literature was in the hands of the clergy and nobles. that the common people could not read and had only a few songs and ballads for their literary portion. As you see here, it contains, let me say, uh, over 40 distinct works, the great bulk of them being romances. There are metrical or verse romances of a French and Celtic and English heroes like Roland, Arthur, and Tristram, and Peeves of Hampton. All these are let me say, story of Alexander, also the Greek romances of Flores and Plancheflore, and the collections of the Oriental tales called the Seven Wise Masters. Uh, there are legends of the virgins and the saints of paraphrase of scripture, uh, uh, a treatise on the seven deadly sins, some papal history, dispute among peers concerning women, I love the songs, or let me say, two visions of purgatory, a vulgar story with the Gallic flavor, a chronicle of English kings and Norman barons, and a political satire. There are a few other works similarly meaningless, crowded together in this typical manuscript, which now gives a mute testimony to the literary taste of the time. So here you see we are to remember also that parchment ware is scarce and very expensive, and that a single manuscript often contained all the reading matters of a castle or village. Hence, this old manuscript is as suggestive as a modern liberty. So here we come to understand here the literary of the Norman period here, and how it developed, as you see. So let us now go to one writer. His work has especially significance as Jewelry of Monmouth. Now, Monmouth here, uh, you see, he was born around 1100, perhaps in Monmouth in southeast Wales. His father was named Arthur. Jewelry served for over 20 years as a master at the College of St. George in Oxford. It was during his time in Oxford, probably around 1136, that Jewelry produced his great work, Historia Regum Britannia, the history of the kings of Britain. I mean here, Jewelry's book here gives a detailed account of the old kings and history dating from the Roman era and climaxing with the reign of King Arthur. So if we want to talk about Jewelry of Monmouth, so it's written, as you see, in the 12th century here. Historia Regiment printed was one of the most popular Latin texts of the Middle Age. Let me say also that this book begins with the settlement of Britain by Protas, the Trojan great grandson of Aeneas, and the Trojan Corinius, let me say, the founder of Cornwall, who extremely uh, thought that jewelry accounts can be seen to be widely inaccurate, but his history is available here as a piece of medieval literature. So the Anglo-Normans, finally, we can conclude all these things to say about the conclusion here, that the Anglo-Normans here refers to the period from the Norman conquest to the middle of the 14th century. As a summary, if I want to make a conclusion to this chapters, we can say that again, Anglo-Norman refers to the period from the Norman conquest to the middle of the 14th century. So the Norman conquest inaugurated a distinctly new epoch where the clergy insisted on the use of Latin and the nobility on the use of French. So chronicles, religious and didactic writing, poetry, and drama were the popular forms of writing. So finally now, I hope that you take all these subjects or sections, sorry, under your considerations, and you have to read it in order to help you to answer any questions in exam. So here we come to finish this lecture. Okay, until I meet you, let me say goodbye and see